Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. There is a second. Okay. Now, what I will do, actually, I needed to do this on the first one. I'll come back. All in favor of adopting the meeting minutes from the 2024 Q3 meeting minutes, say aye.
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 Any opposed, please say nay. Okay, the ayes have it, and so that motion is adopted. And I will go back around and we will actually take a formal vote for the first motion. The motion to accept the actual agenda. So all in favor of accepting the agenda for this meeting, say aye.
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 All
Aye.
opposed, say nay. Okay, and I think the ayes have it. So that motion is adopted. So we've got the motion to adopt the agenda and the motion to adopt the Q3 2024 meeting minutes. I think next up on our agenda is to get to our invited guests. So I'll turn that over.
Thank you so much, Marcus, and good morning, everyone. Happy Halloween. Thanks for being here today. We have just one invited guest with us today, Dr. Molly Mitchell from the Virginia Institute of Marine Sciences, here to contribute to our discussion, particularly around natural infrastructure, which we'll get into during the agenda. Molly, do you just want to say briefly your role at VIMS?
Yes, thank you. I'm faculty of VIMS in the Center for Coastal Resource Management, and I am a marsh ecologist with years of experience in coastal shoreline management.
Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you for being here today. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do is just quickly recap some of the purpose of the subcommittee, what we're doing here today, and what we covered at our last meeting. Sorry, I've got a lot of stuff going on my screen here. So these are the subcommittee objectives for this project prioritization subcommittee. Firstly, to inform and support the flood hazard risk assessment, specifically helping to identify asset data inputs, the approach to quantifying vulnerability, impact assessment outputs for decision-making, coordination, and collaboration. And we'll be talking about both impact assessment outputs and asset data inputs today. Secondly, this subcommittee is tasked with informing and supporting the identification of planned resilience actions, specifically looking at areas where there are shared themes, gaps, trends, and other things of interest between projects and initiatives that are going on throughout the coastal region, which are submitted to our new Coastal Resilience Web Explorer user portal. And then finally, each of the 4 TAC subcommittees is asked to develop recommendations for future planning. You'll see the sub-bullets here that we've discussed at past meetings. And on the next slide, I have our subcommittee schedule. This is tentative and of course subject to change depending on how things go throughout the process. But you can see here for our meeting today, quarter 4, we're going to be talking about risk assessment, outputs and inputs. As we move into our next quarter and looking ahead to the remainder of our planning timeline, we'll be starting to look at future planning recommendations and then also analyzing those planned resilience actions as we receive submissions to the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. A few general updates for you all. So on the topic of that user portal for the Web Explorer, it is now live, so you can access it. Any new users to the portal must submit a user access form, which is available online. It's a PDF. You can complete it electronically and email it to us at the Resilience Explorer account. You can get the form from DCR's website, the first link there, or from the user portal website, the second link. We did receive 143 submissions of projects and initiatives through an initial bulk upload that we did with the Coastal Zone Management team at DEQ. We're currently working through reviews and approvals of those and expect to have those completed before our TAC meeting, which is in December, the second week of December. And then the other major update is that we have received and are reviewing responses to the Resilience Planning and Consulting RFP. that is looking for services to support DCR with elements of this phase 2 plan, as well as our other work on the flood protection master plan and community outreach and engagement. Okay, so I'm going to transition now to talk about some of our continued discussion on the impact assessment outputs. I'm going to do kind of a recap of last meeting and then give some updates on where we're at in taking your feedback and integrating it into our approach. So what we heard from you last meeting was these, I've distilled into these 3 major bullets here on the screen here. So firstly, that we need to better identify the intended audiences for this plan in order to understand what sort of flood hazard impact assessment outputs are going to be useful. Secondly, that we needed to, once we identified that audience, contextualize what flooding means as appropriate for those audiences. And you can see in the blue box there some of the examples of where the discussion went within that topic. And then lastly, to provide guidance alongside those outputs to support decision making. So to actually help interpret some of the impact assessment results and say, okay, we know this now, this is maybe some actions that you could take in the space of adaptation or protection in your community. So we did take that feedback we received and did use it to look at our impact assessment scope. Here are the major kind of updates and the areas where we're requesting feedback from the TAC today. So we have been working on defining that intended audience, determining asset groupings, and then setting a minimum standard for our impact assessment. And we've been working through this with Dewberry, and I should mention that we do have some folks from Dewberry on the call today who can help chime in and add context to the discussion where needed. So Brian and Johanna, thank you for being here. They are currently developing a more detailed scope for what this impact assessment will look like. So this is, these slides are basically setting out the minimum and then where we think this can be headed based on our discussions with Dewberry and our preliminary scoping. And again, we do want your feedback on this during the discussion today. The things specifically that we're requesting feedback on are the end user survey, which we have developed and I'll talk about a little bit more in the slides to come, the natural infrastructure asset grouping and assessment, and then the alternative metrics for jurisdictional capacity. So we'll cover each of these 3 things during the slides. So just a quick recap of how we're thinking about the impact assessment, how it is used within the planning cycle. Again, the purpose of that impact assessment is to support our plan end users to identify and understand vulnerabilities to flooding and facilitate the prioritization of limited resources for protection and adaptation. And we expect that that assessment might help end users in their decision making that could include setting goals and establishing metrics for resilience, selecting projects to advance to implementation, identifying and instituting policies, and/or seeking and allocating funding. On the left side of the screen here, you can see our overarching kind of process for developing this plan. And in dark blue, those flood hazard exposure model, flood hazard impact assessment, et cetera, are the kind of products, the key elements of this planning effort that will be produced. So who are the intended audiences? We have given this some thought and are presenting that the primary audiences for this plan are planning district commissions, localities, state agencies, programs, and tribal governments that are active and operational within the coastal region. When we've been thinking about how might they use the plan, you can see the bullets here on the right. Again, those are similar to what I just covered in the last slide, that these could be a starting point for additional assets, vulnerability assessments, that they could be helpful for incorporating into other long-range planning efforts to leverage some of the findings to prioritize resilience actions, including developing grant applications, just identifying opportunities for collaboration with others, like if there's 2 localities that identify a shared interest and an opportunity to work together, and then to justify budgetary requests. We've asked previously this question of how folks would like to use the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. back during the phase 1 development, we did a centralized stakeholder survey. This received 98 responses. You can see the mix of who responded to that on the left. A lot of local governments did provide responses, and about 63% indicated that they were at least somewhat familiar with this effort, this planning effort from the state. I think most importantly, most interestingly, they did also share some of what they hoped would come out of the Coastal Resilience Master Plan, or how they hope to be able to use it. And that's on the right side of the screen, with prioritizing and funding projects that received 14 responses. And you can read through this list here. The full survey is also, the results are available as an appendix on DCR's website for the Coastal Resilience Master Plan. The link's here at the bottom. So you can take a look at that if it's interesting to you, but I think it is helpful to know that when we did ask previously, these are some of the responses we received. So as we discussed last meeting, and we've talked about with some of the other subcommittees as well, there's interest in conducting an end user survey for phase 2, sort of similarly to the prior centralized stakeholder survey, but really focusing on how people have actually used the phase 1 plan. So that includes the PDF, but also the Web Explorer and the Open Data Portal. And then secondly, the funding subcommittee is interested in knowing more about how localities and others are accessing funding for resilience and what mechanisms they're using, what barriers they have. We're hoping to send this to recipients, including those primary intended plan end users, so local governments, planning district commissions, tribal governments, and then also consultants that are working on behalf of those entities regarding the topic of resilience. We're hoping to issue this in November and receive responses by the end of the calendar year. And some ideas for distribution include sending out to DCR's floodplain management contacts with the request that they share it with the correct individuals working on flood resilience in their organization, if it's not the individual that received it directly. To distribute to planning district commissions via email and request their support with distributing it to their members and consultants, direct emails to tribal governments, and then posting it on the website. And here, especially given that many of you are representing PDCs and others who are active in this space, would appreciate the TAC's feedback on how we can best distribute this survey to get the best responses. I'll hold some time for discussion on this end user survey in detail later on. The full survey is included in the handouts PDF that is in the chat, if you did not get a chance to take a look at it previously. Okay, so we are actually going to take that time to talk through the end user survey now. I can pull up the PDF if you also want to pull it up on your own screen. That might be helpful. The questions that we're asking, again, are focused on the phase 1 plan. We have some introductory questions at the top asking about the who the individual responding is and their contact information. And then we really get into questions about which of the Coastal Resilience Master Planning products have the individuals used in their work, how useful overall the combination of master planning products were to them, an open field for any comments, requests for feedback on potential use cases. So which of these use cases have you used or could you use in your work? Open-ended questions on if they've used the product in other ways or have encountered any limitations. An open-ended question about additional content that they might like to see in future PDF plan documents. A request to rank the usefulness of the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer tools. And this is the different tabs that appear within the Web Explorer. And then a request to share with us if they have downloaded open data. We do have 2 different open data portals. We'd like to know which one they've used. You can check more than one response here with this answer. And that's all that's included in the way of the phase 1 plan, which is really where I'd like to focus our discussion today. If folks do have comments on the funding, we can talk through that, but I'm not going to go through those questions in detail. So I'm going to stop sharing and open it up to the subcommittee for discussion. Maybe I can prompt conversation with a couple of questions. Firstly, does this survey cover the type of information that you think we should know about how people are using the plan in order to better, produce a product for phase 2?
Don't be shy. We want to foster feedback and comments, if there are any.
And if there aren't any comments on the survey questions themselves, you can always follow up with us after this meeting. Of course, send your comments via email. But additionally, are there any comments on how to best distribute this plan to reach the right individuals, the intended audiences?
In terms of distribution, I think maybe, working through VACO or VAMPO would be, or the PDCs would be beneficial.
Thanks, Chris. We have a lot of PDCs on the call. Are you willing to help us distribute this to your localities? Does anybody want to comment on that?
I can comment. Yeah, we'll distribute. Yes, no problem with that. I am a bit curious. My assumption as we've been talking about this is that it would go to locality staff who might be involved in identifying projects or been implementing projects. But if you wanted to go to a different role within local government, that would be helpful to know. Or multiple roles in local government, which would also be an option. Get different points of view. So,
yeah, that's a great point, Sarah. I think we were thinking about this more as going to staff, but also did leave an option in there for folks to indicate if they were from a different role within local government. So certainly not opposed to those folks responding to it. I think the types of questions that we're asking are going to be most staff are going to be the ones who really have the answers to them. But for some of the funding questions in particular, there might be, city council or, other folks within the local government who would be interested in responding. So not opposed to those folks, but I think staff are probably the target audience here. Okay.
Carolyn, just a couple thoughts. I think one, obviously we're happy to share it with our localities. I don't know what kind of response rate we're going to get from something like this. I think following this up with some sort of, workshop or other sort of opportunity to kind of lead attendees through the master plan and get some feedback that way might provide some more information to you all. I think this has come up in previous discussions, but considering that this is supposed to be a state level plan, I would be really interested to have some more discussion and hear more from some of the state agency attendees about what they want to get out of this plan. Our localities are already doing their own resilience planning work. They're already adopting their own comprehensive plans, and those ones, the things that they're doing individually are targeted for exactly what they're trying to do in terms of adopting local policies that best suit the desires and capacity of their residents and, their decision makers at that level. But I think, what does the state want to get out of this plan? And what do the state agencies hope to do with this plan? I think that's a different type of discussion, I think. And I haven't heard any answers to that yet. But I'm not sure that I don't know how closely they overlap, I guess.
Yeah, Ben, this is Chris. I can try to answer that from a VDOT perspective. And I think we've been talking about this over other meetings, but we see this as maybe a launching point for our resilience plan. We continue to refine sort of the strategies that were laid out in our resilience plan, and that we're kind of developing them and implementing them. We're also looking to further refine our vulnerability assessment and how we translate that into some type of visualization tool that we can inform our decision making. So in terms of how we're looking at the CRMP, we want to make sure that we're consistent between the two, that we're coming up with generally the same viewpoint and understanding, but we also understand that the VDOT vulnerability assessment may look at more specific things to the department, like pavement conditions, average daily traffic counts, how we view that part of the network in terms of criticality, what's its connections to, critical services like medical services, is it an evacuation route? And I don't expect the CRMP or any other sort of statewide level outside of VDOT to really kind of try to tackle that issue. So to me, we're viewing them as just counterparts to one another. I view CRMP to kind of inform all state agencies. If a state agency wants to rely on it wholly, that's great. If a state agency wants to do more specific to their agency, I think like VDOT's doing, I think that's kind of on them. So that's how we're viewing this.
I don't want to change topics, but I do just want to acknowledge Mary Carson's comment in the chat. Thank you for your willingness to share it with the CRS work group. Are there any other discussion points around the continued conversation about state agencies as end users, or the end user survey itself? Okay. If not, let me get back to my spot in the slideshow. And again, if you do get a chance to take a look at the survey in a little bit more detail, maybe you haven't really looked at it fully yet, but want to, please feel free and send us your written comments via email. Okay. So in this section, we're kind of moving on to discuss the impact assessment itself as a component of the plan. Much of this section of the presentation is using information from Appendix E of the Phase 1 plan. I did send that around in an email in advance. It's also available on the DCR website if you would like to take a look just for more background information. But as a reminder, the impact assessment is applying flood hazard exposure models for coastal rainfall driven or pluvial and riverine or fluvial flooding to the assets in the coastal region to understand what will be impacted by flooding and how. So I'm going to go through this section in kind of three parts. Firstly, which assets are we talking about? What assets are we assessing for their flood risk? How are we measuring impacts to those assets? And then how are we reporting on our findings? So here, starting with assets, one of the foundational elements of this assessment is really identifying, again, which assets we want to assess for their impacts in the plan, considering, again, those primary audiences that we've been discussing: state agencies, localities, planning district commissions, et cetera. So with phase 2, our proposal is to generally look at the same assets that were assessed during phase 1. We would be doing this assessment really at the level of the individual asset, and then working up from there to categorize and group that assessment with other like assets to help communicate data within a thematic area. So you can kind of see some of those groupings on the right in the phase 1, phase 2 table, hopefully. The results of that assessment for those groupings would also be reported at the jurisdictional scale, so city, county, planning district commission, but also at the watershed scale for phase 2. So you can see here, there's some minor changes to how we're thinking about the groupings, but largely these are the same assets. We will talk about natural infrastructure a bit in more detail. In addition to those, the direct assets that we're assessing in phase 1, we also looked at community context. So the two major components of that were social vulnerability and jurisdictional resources and capacity. And these were provided as context in the phase 1 plan, but they weren't directly assessed for the flood hazard impacts. So you can see on the right an example of one way in which that was included in the plan. This is showing both social vulnerability and coastal flood hazard in a kind of bivariate view for one of the PDCs, but this was done for all of them. So to summarize the new or altered asset groupings, we are looking to do some additional critical infrastructure sectors and reorganize those components to align with the VDEM and their CISA approach. So I've mentioned previously in these calls that VDEM is working on standing up a critical infrastructure working group that would include state agencies as well as critical infrastructure owners. One of those kind of key charges of that group, as we've discussed with VDEM, would be to identify what is critical in the Commonwealth and kind of rank criticality according to CISA and kind of national approaches taken. So we're looking at some additional sectors that would align with those sectors that VDEM is including the ones listed here. But note that not all the assets will be able to be analyzed similarly for flood impacts in the assessment. For example, dams are not vulnerable to flooding in the same way as some of the other assets and would need to be looked at differently if they're included at all. We would reorganize this under human and built critical infrastructure categories to align with our status of flood resilience approach and the code relevant to this resilience work, and then would maintain our assessment approach to focus firstly on exposure, and we'll talk more about that in the slides to come. And then we're also looking at revising natural infrastructure components, which we'll talk more about later during the slides. So the second major element of our approach is how are we measuring impacts to assets? So beyond identifying which assets we're assessing and how they're grouped, we also need to figure out what level of assessment we can conduct using our approach. So in phase 1, this is again a graphic from that appendix. We had 4 different levels of impact assessment that are shown on the right side of the screen: narrative, exposure, vulnerability, or risk. And this was developed using the components you see on the left. They really kind of build upon each other. So exposure, vulnerability, and risk. You're kind of looking at from exposure, will an individual asset experience flooding? Yes or no. Vulnerability, what is that exposure combined with sensitivity and adaptive capacity of that asset? So you need more information on those asset characteristics to be able to determine that. And then lastly, risk, you're considering also quantification or categorization of the consequences, financial or otherwise, of that vulnerability. So they each build on each other. You need additional inputs to reach the next kind of level. But what we want to emphasize is that at this scale, using our quantitative assessment approaches, the available data really creates the limitations for this assessment. So how accurate and how complete is our data about both flood hazard and assets to be able to move down kind of this ladder? And then lastly, we also want to be sure to consider what level of analysis is most useful to anticipated end users to receive via this plan. So, Chris has already shared that VDOT is doing additional analysis in their own plans for their purposes that is not appropriate necessarily to include in this plan. So considering that across the board, what is appropriate for the state level plan focusing on flood resilience across all sectors and a lot of assets. The other thing we wanted to flag is that we're thinking about risk not just as financial. It could also include assigning level of criticality or direct and indirect consequences. In phase 1, we did consider risk only as financial, but that doesn't necessarily need to be the case for phase 2. So we're considering what additional means of quantification could exist for risk. Just in terms of the hazard inputs for this assessment, this has been discussed and will continue to be discussed by the Research, Data, and Innovation Subcommittee, but I wanted to share what has been discussed there. We would be looking at all 3 of the hazards, but for kind of different levels of specificity and information for each. So for coastal hazards, we're reusing the phase 1 data. We've got quite a lot of data there, so can use the highest availability level of analysis. Similarly, for pluvial hazards, the third orangish box here, that we're producing that data now and will conduct the highest available level of analysis possible. For riverine hazards, we're only going to have information on the current special flood hazard area. So we will have the ability to conduct some limited categorical vulnerability. Is it in or out of a floodplain? And also, is it an important asset? Is it a critical asset, et cetera, to help us get to vulnerability? But beyond that, will be fairly limited in our approach. And then we're looking at opportunities to combine hazards, looking at exposure for all 3. We have not totally defined what that could look like, and that could be something we discussed today. But some kind of information on all 3 hazards for various different asset groupings. During phase 1, this table shows the highest level of assessment for different groupings of assets that we looked at. So you can see on the right-hand side, the associated metrics produced. So again, this is not all of the metrics produced, but just the highest level of assessment looking at that continuum of exposure to risk. So you can see here that we did vulnerability for quite a number of assets, but we also looked at just the exposure level for certain assets, including population and critical infrastructure, most notably. So again, that's just, is the asset going to experience flooding or likely to experience flooding or not? In terms of risk, we looked at that for structures, public, commercial, and residential structures by calculating average annualized loss. So quantifying the direct financial impacts of losing that structure and its contents. So our approach for phase 2 for output metrics, again, we're hoping to start with the same assessment data and methodology that we've used from phase 1 that we've just reviewed. But we would like to take an iterative approach to move from that continuum exposure to risk where feasible. So as we're identifying data availability and finding opportunities to move beyond exposure, we will do so. We plan to conduct a unique impact assessment by asset for each flood hazard. So looking at them independently. And then lastly, presenting results by individual flood hazard and hopefully finding a means to communicate combined potential impacts for different assets. In terms of the specific metrics, this is a comprehensive list of all of the metrics that were produced during phase 1 in black. So organized by exposure, vulnerability, risk, and also those contextual metrics at the bottom we talked about previously. Where we see opportunities to go beyond those phase 1 metrics, we've put those in the italicized gray font. So for exposure, looking at using social vulnerability beyond a contextual measure to apply it as a lens through which we're looking at annualized population exposure. So annualized social socially vulnerable population experiencing flooding. Under vulnerability, up here on the top right, during phase 1, we did develop a measure for population displacement during phase 1, but ultimately didn't use it because we determined it was basically too basic to reflect the realities and patterns of how displacement occurs in practice. But we'd like to look at whether there's perhaps some additional way we can present that information without necessarily quantifying it in very precise terms to share maybe hotspots of areas that might experience displacement or something similar. For risk, again, here we could quantify the value of assets which are being lost or exposed. And during phase 1, we did that just for the structural elements as we discussed, but there might be opportunities to do that for things like ecosystem services value. That's something that will be discussed, I believe, at the funding subcommittee later this week. And then potentially whether we have some additional measures of criticality that we can use to apply to risk. So finally, here talking about how we're reporting our findings. During phase 1, we produced these asset level reporting that was not shared externally. It was internal only, and it was produced using Tableau to really show for individual assets over time the different metrics that we produced. We also produced narrative impacts in the plan, so text and graphics like what's shown at the bottom left here to help contextualize what some of those numbers meant in practice and use some of those survey results to share additional context. We produced tabular data across different jurisdictions that was available for download in Excel, but also summaries were included in the Web Explorer and the plan document for different asset groupings. And then comparative and gridded hotspot identification were available as layers in the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer. They were included in the PDF plan, and they were also available for, some of them were available for GIS downloads. So this is the summary of everything that went into that outputs of the phase 1 plan. And for phase 2, what we'd like to do is to build on what we did during phase 1. These are some of the opportunities that we see to do that, including updated summaries in the PDF for all hazards and asset themes. We'd like to consider some additional context with impact stories, particularly for getting beyond flood exposure with some additional stories. I'll share what that looks like, an example of what that could look like on the next slide. We'd like to do some additional hotspot and gaps analysis based on the impact findings, but also leveraging some of the data that we pull from the Coastal Resilience Web Explorer user portal about where we know that there are projects and initiatives ongoing in the region. We'd like to update our data viewers in the Web Explorer for all hazards and asset themes and include in that summaries of impacts across the whole PDC and locality using a polygon format in addition to that gridded impact summary of raster files, so that when you zoom out, you can kind of see comparatively across, based on that entire locality or whole PDC, what that comparison would look like. And then tabular and shapefile data download availability, we'd like to continue making that available and expand it to include additional outputs for all of the metrics we're producing, making those available in a more accessible and kind of single location. And then lastly, decision-making support in the form of case studies and post-plan technical assistance. We're talking about, again, how to get to that third point of feedback that you all provided at the last meeting about not just saying, here are the impacts, but then also providing some guidance. And here we think we could perhaps provide some technical assistance after the plan is complete to help cater the data to different use cases that a locality or a PDC might have. They might know that the data is available and be interested, but not quite know how to leverage it for their purposes. So we're wondering and considering whether we could use some of our on-call assistance to help respond to those needs. Just quickly, an example of the impact stories and what those could look like. Here we're thinking about illustrating some cross-cutting themes relevant across different asset types to really communicate those indirect consequences of flooding that we can't quite quantitatively measure, but that we know to be a potential challenge. So an example of that is impacts of flooding on water quality. We might be able to share some information about location of point source pollution facilities and how flooding might impact those, the location within a watershed, as well as some more non-point source pollution sources, pinpointing those, sharing information about what that might look like in practice. Although we won't have a very detailed quantitative analysis, we could include kind of a vignette or a case study impact story here in the plan. So we, during our last meeting and even at the beginning of this meeting, talked a bit about what work VDOT is already doing around impact assessment and transportation assets. So we met with VDOT since the last meeting and did discuss this topic. And so I wanted to hand it over to Chris to share some of what we talked about how VDOT would be, how their transportation assets would be included in the plan. Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. I alluded to some of this, but we had this type of conversation during our last subcommittee meeting about, what level of detail VDOT's transportation facilities should be reflected in the CRMP. And I think at the time I suggested that, the CRMP kind of stay consistent, evaluating this sector in a manner very similar to the other sectors. We did have some follow-up conversations, and I think we still are of that opinion for a couple reasons. One, I think our level of analysis may be very specific to the transportation industry. I mentioned it before, we're going to look at, pavement condition, criticality, adaptive capacity, things of that nature. But there's also just an issue of timing. We are endeavoring on that right now. And one, we're having to do the analysis, but also we are, working this through our leadership so that they understand how this data would be used to inform decision-making through planning, design, operation, and maintenance. So I can't really sit here and commit to saying we'll have that ready in time for the CRMP's timing, which is, legislatively driven. So what we're considering or suggesting is that, the transportation analysis stays where it is and sort of the way Carolyn has been laying it out, and that we'll just work very closely between the two agencies on sharing where each of us are headed. When data is available or becomes available, we'll make sure that that information is flowing over just from a consistency standpoint. And then, in terms of, the last bullet here, we don't know really how we're going to use this information in a public setting to help others like localities and inform their decision making. So, to try to do it through this effort, I think it just might be a little premature. So we would recommend sort of having two separate efforts, one to address the CRMP's goals, and then the other to address the specific VDOT transportation goals, which would be sort of a more detailed evaluation. So Carolyn, I don't know if you have any questions. I can stop for other members of the committee and see if there's any questions.
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I see Brian has his hand raised. So Brian, do you want to share something?
I just wanted to note real quick that I know the way, we have a image here of how the road vulnerability is summarized in the viewer. And there was a conscious decision made at the time at the end of phase one that we do have the vulnerability data on the vector road layers with a lot of detail. We just decided not to show that in the viewer. So it is available. It's somewhat visualized in the report, but that is another part of the aspect of what was done here. So it is simplified for what's in the viewer, and it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. It just depends on how it wants to, everyone decides to present it at the end of the day.
Yeah, that's a good point, Brian. And I would say our current approach is going to be by the actual road segment in vector form. But it may be appropriate to keep this kind of rasterized so that, we're not looking at it as a one-to-one. You know, I did share we want to be consistent and things of that nature, but should there be any discrepancy, maybe the difference between raster and vector may be a good crosswalk, so that someone doesn't look at the CRMP and say, well, why did you not come up with the same level of vulnerability from the CRMP to the VDOT specific analysis?
Right, Chris. And VDOT's aware that there is like segment exposure data on the vector lines for the roads for the whole state available through the CMRP phase 1.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to make sure I was just trying to verify, because you know, indeed, like we pulled the whole vector data set for the whole state, including I think secondary roads, and did overlay the multi-frequency kind of flood exposure for the coastal flood for all those road segments. And that was part of our deliverable to the state. It's buried somewhere in the databases, which I know can be at times hard to navigate. But if that's something that VDOT needs, I think we could work with DCR to make sure we get that over to you so you can see that product if it helps you.
Yeah, that's great. Our resilience manager, Maria Mutuk's on the call, so I'm sure she's taking note. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. I'm going to quickly, I have just a couple more slides and then we'll pause for discussion and we can talk more about VDOT at that point as well. But just to get through these, teeing up the conversation around natural infrastructure. So as I mentioned, we're looking at opportunities to really think through the natural infrastructure thematic area and the assets that are incorporated within that in the impact assessment. You can see on the left here from the phase 1 approach, we looked at components, subcomponents, assets in a very kind of similar structure to how we grouped the other assets in the impact assessment. However, there wasn't a lot of differentiation between those different layers. So that's to say that in many categories, the assets that you see and the subcomponents that you see are actually pretty much the same. So as we shared previously, we also used land loss and habitat loss as our primary metrics here for whether or not something was vulnerable. And a lot of our input data came from VIMS as well as NOAA and some DCR on conserved areas. So during phase 2, what we're thinking about is taking a less hierarchical approach to this and really allow that assets can and may overlap across these different categories. And so we would categorize natural infrastructure based on the type, such as land cover, but also maybe think about the different ways in which we prioritize natural infrastructure for different reasons. So ecological priority, use for working lands, whether or not those lands are already conserved or if conserving them would have some benefit, and then potentially where there's some capacity for adaptation, such as wetland migration potential, and maybe others. We're opening that up for your discussion and feedback today. For output metrics, again, we see the continuing use of land and habitat loss as a valuable metric here, but are open to other potential metrics that would be valuable for the end users, potentially maybe proximity to flood risk, using some sort of buffer around exposure areas to identify high potential for impacts. That is something that we have discussed with our natural heritage team at DCR as we've been talking through how we might reorganize this with various folks between these subcommittee meetings. To get to those different kind of groupings of assets that were shared on the last slide, such as priority ecological landscapes, we would propose to use existing data sets that have already identified and prioritized those assets. So you can see 4 different examples of sources of that data here, and we're open to your feedback and ideas for how to both appropriately group those assets and also which input data to use. So won't talk about each of these in detail. You can access these online, but some options for priority ecological landscapes include the DCR natural habitat and ecosystem priorities layer, which includes kind of unprotected high priority lands for conservation, and the DCR potential rare species richness layer. That is rankings of conserved and non-conserved lands for their potential, suitability for rare species and habitat priority. And then there's a couple of others here, the resilient and connected network layer from the Nature Conservancy and the VIMS opportunity for wetlands migration layer. This is a screenshot from ADAPT's VA. And maybe Molly can share more about that one as well. And I am going to pause there to open it up for discussion regarding the natural infrastructure theme, as well as any other questions, comments, feedback on our proposed phase 2 impact assessment.
Hey, Carolyn.
Hey, Molly.
Can I just let you know about, there's a new marsh migration product coming out. So we did a project for the Chesapeake Bay Trust to take multiple models to make a multi-model combined marsh migration layer. So taking NOAA's and the SLAM model that's been done and the INVEST modeling that was done. And so the Chesapeake Bay program has now applied that across the Chesapeake Bay. So that might be worth looking at as something to include.
Great, thank you.
Carolyn, I had a question about some of the previous slides. Do you mind going back to the one that referenced the potential for ecosystem services to be incorporated as some of what would be lost in the impact analysis? Okay, maybe it was.
Is it this one, the output metrics?
Yes. So can you talk just a little bit more about how the assessment will take into account some of the additional benefits that are provided? Because I guess my question, I have two questions. So the vulnerability measurement is part of what is being looked at for the tidal habitat, right? And what is vulnerability? What is included in vulnerability? Like, how are we really measuring the losses?
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the habitat, then I guess the ecosystem services, how does that factor in currently versus later?
So I might ask Dewberry to jump in and help me out with this if I say anything incorrectly from what was done during phase 1. But so the impact assessment, the vulnerability for the different natural infrastructure was largely looking at the change in the tidal zone. So is an area permanently inundated by water or not? And that is how we determined these measures of habitat loss and land loss, kind of overlaid with these different types of habitats in the landscape. So knowing where these different features were, and then are they permanently inundated, like by mean high water? So that's really how it was done during phase 1. My understanding is that we were not, for the most part, across all of those assets, we're not looking at additional ecosystem services and quantifying those losses during phase 1.
Okay. Yep. And that's how it was just straight up drowning.
Yes, to clarify, for the aquatic and tidal habitats, that was change in water depth rather than the loss of land itself, but very much a kind of crude metric to get a sense of those trends. We did do research into the various ways to evaluate, put dollar values and on the ecosystem services and other factors. I think those numbers ranged a lot, and in discussions with the TAC was decided that that wasn't a productive direction to continue in at that time.
Okay. And then the phase 2, I think, was on the next. Yeah. Okay. So Can you explain just the difference in analysis and what we can expect with phase 2?
So to be honest, I can't totally explain the work that's being done. My understanding is that VIMS and potentially others are working on some ways to measure ecosystem value for these different assets. So I don't know, Molly, if you're prepared to speak to some of that. And then basically it would be taking that work and combining it with the loss. So Molly.
Sure. So we have a NOAA funded project right now to look at valuation for different shoreline habitats based on different values. So based on water quality, habitat, and recreational values, and mostly based on numbers from literature reviews, that kind of thing.
Okay. And does that include, I know that the carbon marketplace issue is a big one and very complicated, but
Very complicated. It does include carbon values, but this is actually something we've been wrestling with a little bit because it's carbon values out of the literature. For living shorelines, we've measured it, but the rest of it's coming from the literature. The thing is, carbon sequestration varies broadly across marshes, and so there's kind of this assumed amount of carbon associated with the stock that's in the valuation. So it is incorporated. It's just maybe has a higher uncertainty bars than some of the other values.
And less tied to market and more tied to science.
Yeah, the valuation of the carbon is actually, it is tied to market values, the numbers, but they're based on the amount of stock that's assumed to be held in the marsh. So that's the science piece. Yeah.
Okay. So it is both. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Molly, quick question. When would that effort be completed? Like, is it on a timeline that, like, if there was some numbers for lost habitat across the Commonwealth for the CMRP, that those numbers could be applied to it to capture some of those potential valuations for phase 2?
Yeah, there's about 8 more months, I think, left on the project. But it's it's getting closer. So I guess it's one of those things maybe where we could talk, right? About what it is you're specifically looking for and what level that information is at.
Yeah, we are talking with Karina over at VIMS on this work and are going to be discussing it at the funding subcommittee in 2 days.
So it's being discussed in the funding subcommittee. Is that because the research or the work needs to be funded?
No, discussing in the funding subcommittee because we're focusing largely on just financial information. And so there's overlap here with the risk metric and getting at financial metrics. But we've got Rachel with VMRC is in the funding subcommittee and looking to establish baseline values for our wetlands and other natural resources to then be able to drive towards this. So Carolyn and I are kind of working in the background to coordinate this, and then it gets reported out to the full TAC. And it might shift where it ends up in the next set of quarterly meetings based on just the discussions, but that's just kind of where it was kind of initiated with some of those discussions. So we've been talking with Karina. There's some additional literature that came out of FEMA for some numbers for ecosystem values. So trying to understand if and what we should be doing to try to get at more quantitative natural infrastructure impacts.
Yeah, that's helpful. Understood.
Jack had put a comment in the chat regarding consideration of normalizing some of these metrics across different geographic scales, looking at percent of assets exposed versus just the raw number of assets. I believe we did that during phase one. I wonder, Johanna, if you want to talk about anything regarding what was done during phase one there in terms of the comparative kind of gridded approach.
Sorry to clarify, for the social vulnerability and
just for any, in terms of in the phase one approach, looking at the different comparative scales for all assets, that you could look at kind of the comparison of one of these metrics within a locality down to at the locality scale, or you could zoom out and look at comparisons across the PDC. And then also kind of the tabular data that was presented in the plan. I think we did have percentages for different impacts in addition to just raw numbers. Is that right?
Gotcha. Yes, we did. So all of the demographic information was attributed down to building footprint scale. That was mostly for statistical analysis purposes, not something that we would feel like confident sharing more openly. But with that, we also used a gridded framework with grid cells that's kind of drives a lot of the mapping that you see both in the plan document and in the web viewer of around 1,200 feet by 1,200 feet to synthesize kind of all of the information around the hazards, the point-based assets, the kind of residential building footprints. All of that information was attributed to that grid cell that allowed for comparison across and like kind of joining and unioning and comparing across any of the factors that were considered, and as well as scaling up to create summaries and compare summaries by any geographic scale you wanted. We focused on jurisdictional boundaries at varying scales down to the community, the county, the PDC, the region, but also allowed to index those values so you could have relatively high to relatively low and compare that again within your chosen geography of interest. So the areas that might be high, like relatively high for a specific community might not be the highest or pop up if you're looking PDC wide. So allowing that different ability to view and hone in on your priorities based on what kind of user you are.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or comments on this impact assessment approach? Oh, MC, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry to feel like I'm monopolizing the questions here, but I had a question about on that same slide, there reference under the ecosystem services to measures of criticality / scale of impact. This is something that our organization cares a great deal about, the opportunity to kind of elevate our natural infrastructure into a critical infrastructure conversation. And that was one of the outputs of the TAC under Governor Northam under the phase one completion. And so I just wondered how phase two starts to think about that. I mean, that's to me what this second bullet is getting at, but that's my perspective and the way that I'm thinking about this. I don't know if that's the same lens by which you all meant by including this bullet.
Yeah, I don't think that bullet needs to be specific to natural infrastructure. It could be applied to different types of assets that we're talking about, but it certainly could be applied to natural infrastructure. And we have been having ongoing conversations with our natural heritage team and others about how do we define critical natural infrastructure. What does that mean? And I think this, these slides about natural infrastructure start to get to where we're at with thinking about it, but we definitely do not have we haven't reached a definition of critical natural infrastructure. If that's based on some of these factors, ecological priority, you know, working land status, et cetera, or something else entirely. So if that's something that you all have ideas about, we are certainly open to hearing them. And that's kind of what we're trying to get to with this different approach for natural infrastructure, is not presenting just the different types of assets by land cover, but also looking at what is important to our society when it comes to natural infrastructure for different reasons, and how can we use some of those existing data sets, or maybe there are opportunities to create new. I don't know that we'll have time to do it in the phase 2 plan, but as a future kind of recommendation to get to criticality in a different way. So any feedback on that is very welcome.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I think, you know, we'd love to work with whomever to build out the value. Obviously, what Molly's described seems comprehensive, you know, but I'm sure it's difficult to quantify the value to the recreational community, to the fishing industry, to the recreational fishing and hunting industry, and all of the many factors that go into why wetlands, and particularly tidal wetlands, are essential to our economic as well as environmental health. So I'm glad to see that it's included, and I don't really have any bright ideas other than ensuring that all of those values are captured in a dollar amount so that we can begin to provide some sort of comparison between the value of critical infrastructure that's built and physical and human versus the natural. So anyway, happy to talk about that.
Great, thank you. Okay, well, I'll just share that looking back at the phase 1, some of the centralized survey results and what we did hear from folks and what we produced, I think the biggest change here really is looking at all flood hazards, in particular having the pluvial data is going to make this impact assessment look very differently, I think, for phase 2, not necessarily in the natural infrastructure space, because this is still remaining pretty focused on you know, loss of these lands to permanent inundation, but across the other assets, I think the fact that we're including all flood hazards is going to make the impact assessment more relevant to a lot of the communities that maybe didn't see a lot of relevance with just coastal hazards, and provide additional, you know, just additional information and knowledge across the coastal region when it comes to flooding. Okay. If there's no further comments on the impact assessment approach in terms of the outputs, I will move to the asset data inputs and any additional subcommittee discussion. So this is a kind of list of the primary asset data input sources from phase 1. We saw some of this in the previous slide on natural infrastructure with the list of VIMs and DCR and NOAA inputs. But across the different themes, these are the major data sets and data sources that we used. You can see the full data catalog in that Appendix E if you're interested in taking a look. We're still working through with Dewberry kind of a look at the different data, the opportunities to update data that might exist. In particular, we're interested in looking at using the most up-to-date versions of different data sets that may have been updated since the phase 1 impact assessment, such as census data. So that's certainly something we're in the process of reviewing. But we're also interested in a specific request, which is to get the TAC's feedback on how we can best measure jurisdictional resources and capacity. So during the phase 1 plan, we looked at the fiscal stress index to capture that. And this slide gives an overview of what that fiscal stress index is. This information was from the last report produced by the Commission on Local Government, which is staffed by DHCD, from July of 2023 for fiscal year 21. And what we're really looking for in the coastal plan for our purposes is a measure to consider jurisdictional capacity of local governments to understand and respond to conditions of flood risk. So their capacity to support resilience efforts such as planning projects and initiatives. This fiscal stress index is measuring localities' ability to generate additional local revenue from its existing tax base relative to the rest of the Commonwealth. And its purpose is to help understand how the state should be distributing aid to those counties and cities in the Commonwealth. And it evenly weights 3 different variables: revenue capacity, revenue effort, and median household income. So I know that there was some discussion during phase 1 about this topic and whether or not to include it, what best to include to measure jurisdictional resources and capacity. We want to kind of revisit that conversation with you all and see if there are any ideas or feedback on using this and or other means to capture that information. Should add that also we did survey localities and others during phase 1, and that information was included as narrative context in the plan, where we had responses about what capacity did exist. So that is in the plan, and that is another opportunity. It doesn't necessarily need to be an index like this that we're using to quantify it. It could be additional narrative information as well. So more to come on impact assessment input data at our next meeting, but would love to hear from any members on how we can best measure jurisdictional resources and capacity and whether fiscal stress index is an appropriate metric to use. I guess the question might be, do you all think that localities are aware of and knowledgeable about the fiscal stress index?
Carol, this has been, I think one of the issues with the fiscal stress index is that, it only really focuses on, financial capacity. And if we're talking about planning capacity, the ability to make, to go through the processes needed to make more informed decisions about, policies or, infrastructure or other sorts of, local responsibilities, that it's really not it's only going to answer part of whether or not they could even, potentially afford to do those things from a monetary perspective. I wonder if some sort of assessment of, what kind of staffing localities have might be a useful thing. This is something that came up actually during some of the resilience coordination working group discussions, this idea of, do localities actually have the capacity to do this kind of work? And, do you have 2 people on staff? Do you have 1 person who's wearing 3 hats? Do you have a full planning department, a few dozen people that are, showing up to work every day? That might help inform, state initiatives or funding levels for improving capacity to actually do the work, not just to be able to afford improvements.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, that's helpful.
But I'm not aware of any sort of assessment of that's been done in the Commonwealth. It's possible that, the JLARC or somebody else has looked into it, but, we kind of know, I think for the PDCs, we have a handle on kind of which of our communities have higher or lower levels of capacity you know, at the staffing level, but you know, even we haven't done any sort of actual census on that.
Mm-hmm.
Carolyn, we debated this the first time around and felt like this was the most familiar metric.
Okay.
I don't know if there might be value in looking at debt capacity as some of these programs get more mature, and that is one of the limiting factors.
Mm-hmm.
It's a little bit different than, you know, your ability to generate local revenue. Is can you borrow any more money?
Mm-hmm.
So but I don't have a good place to point you to. Just an idea.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many different things that go into a local government's capacity and resources, including, you know, political willingness to, you know, it's not just do you have the capacity to raise taxes, but are you willing to do so? That also is very important. And that's just one element of that. But yeah, any ideas are welcome. I think a lot of it will get back to doing some research and contact with the localities themselves to understand their staffing and so forth, stuff that's kind of more difficult to do without actually talking to somebody who's working for the government. Any other comments on this or any other topics of discussion that the subcommittee wishes to discuss today? This is open for any other new business that you all would like to raise. Okay. If not, I think we can move to public comment.
Nobody has indicated in the chat they would like to speak during public comment.
Okay, if you would like to provide public comment, you can let us know. Have about 5 minutes for each individual to provide comments to the subcommittee. Okay. Hearing none. Can move quickly to action items and scheduling. So there weren't all that many action items that I captured from our meeting today. We received some good feedback on some of our topics that I've certainly taken notes on, and we do have VCU collecting meeting minutes, and this meeting is also being recorded. There are a couple items to follow up with VIMS and Wetlands Watch regarding the natural infrastructure assessment. And again, if you do have any further comments on any of these topics, but particularly on the end user survey, please do feel welcome to send those to us via email so we can take those into account. Our next full TAC meeting will be on December 15th. It is all virtual, and you should have received an invitation to attend, which includes a Zoom link to receive. You need to, like this one, sign up to receive the actual link to participate in the meeting. Our poll of survey, our survey of preference times for these meetings showed most people prefer either Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday mornings. So we're going to try our best to stick with those moving forward. We do have to have our next meeting of the subcommittee in person, so do expect that to be an in-person meeting. And our agenda will include additional updates on the inputs to the impact assessment, so more on those asset inputs, and then we'll start talking about recommendations for future plans. That's all I've got.
Okay. Thank you very much, Carolyn. We appreciate that. And we appreciate you helping to facilitate that. Before I adjourn, are there any other last items that we need to bring up? Okay. Thank you again, Carolyn. Thank you, Wheeler. And we appreciate the subcommittee meeting again. You'll get information on the next meeting, as Carolyn mentioned. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you all. Bye.
Meeting's adjourned.